For 3 decades, a little sister was suspected to be her 15-year-old sister's killer. However, the evidence found in the brutal murder pointed to a male killer from the beginning. Later in life, she would go on Dr. Phil to clear her name, and 35 years after her sister was found, her real killer was named. You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna. I cannot even tell you how unfathomable this case is, that a 13-year-old girl would be accused of her sister's murder for 35 years and everybody in the town started believing it. I mean, she spoke about how sometimes her mother even started to believe it. And so for all of that time, this little girl who grew up to be a woman had been accused of this horrific and brutal crime that didn't even point to this being done by a woman. It is just so incredibly wild. And then I also found another case that took so many years to solve that happened around the same area to a woman who was brutally murdered as well. So we're going to dive into that because it connects to this case as well. So let's go ahead and get into the story. Make sure you are subscribed if you are not already. These days I've been finding it more and more difficult to get to sleep without struggling for hours overthinking, and I really think it's when I focus too much on the tragedies and the sadness of the world. I think that those of us who are really passionate about these victim stories, we have so much empathy that it often weighs so heavily, and when it comes to sleep, I think that that is where many of us struggle, especially myself. And so I'm always looking for ways to help this, and so that's why I want to thank our sponsor Beam. Beam Hot Chocolate has a dream powder which helps you to get the best kind of sleep. I cannot tell you how calm my nighttime routine has become after taking this. You just take it about 30 minutes before bed. Take it as in you drink your hot chocolate 30 minutes before bed, and it is so incredibly good. They have a CBD version as well as a non-CBD version. I do the non-CBD version, and without CBD, the main ingredients to help me fall asleep and stay asleep with no grogginess in the morning is apigenin, reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, and melatonin. But before bed, I just put 1 to 2 scoops in a cup and either put hot milk or hot water and blend it together, and it tastes so delicious. The one that I love is the cinnamon cocoa, but they also have chocolate peanut butter and mint chip in the non-CBD version. So you can use my link to subscribe and save 20% on Dream Powder, plus get an additional 15% off and a free frother when you use my code BROOKEM. All you have to do is click my link down below or scan the QR code on the screen, and that will get you 35% off the original price. And you can pause, skip, or cancel anytime, so there is no risk. So if that's something that you struggle with and need help with, maybe try some Dream Powder from Beam. So it was 1984 in North Carolina, and Reesa Trexler was a 15-year-old born on October 10th of 1968 to parents Gary and Vicky. Now, Reesa also had a 13-year-old sister named Jody, and the eldest girl, Reesa, she was said to have a heart of gold. She never met a stranger, and she was always willing to help others. She was described as the one to make everybody laugh, and she was just alive and fun, and Jody was said to really look up to her big sister, whom she even shared a room with. And even though they fought like regular siblings, they had a bond like no other. So on June 15th of 1984, Reesa and Jody were planning to have the best summer day. It was pretty early on in the summer. They didn't have school, so they invited some friends over who were Paul and Jim. They lived nearby, and they came over to hang out and watch some MTV. Now, Jim was said to have a little bit of a crush on Reesa, but he also knew that they were just friends. Later on that day, Reesa decided that she wanted to watch her favorite soap operas, and they were about to begin. She didn't really want to bother anybody, so the boys ended up going home, and Reesa headed next door around 3 p.m. Now, next door was actually her grandparents' home. They both lived on North Shaver Street, and in fact, the whole block was said to be family. They were all very close-knit. But that day when Reesa went over to watch the soap operas there, they actually weren't home, and she didn't know that. However, she was okay with just being there alone. Her grandfather, Walt, had actually run to the grocery store to pick up a few things, and then her grandmother had gone to the hairdresser. So both of their cars were gone, and she headed inside, and started watching soap operas, and her sister Jody was back at their home, and she was alone as well. However, her grandfather would arrive home first, and when he did, he would find a crime scene. His scream allegedly echoed through the neighborhood, and Jody ended up hearing this and came running over. This was around 5 p.m. and Reese's body was found on the floor of the grandparents' spare bedroom, and she was nude, besides still wearing her jewelry, which was a bracelet, a watch, and a ring. She had been stabbed several times in the upper chest and neck area, but no signs of forced entry were found, and it didn't appear that anything was stolen. Now, when Reese's mother, Vicky, arrived to their home, she immediately knew that something was wrong after looking over and seeing her father, their grandfather's face. She ran over and she ended up crawling inside to Reesa and seeing her body. She said that she looked like a China doll. Even investigators were devastated upon arriving to the scene, and Jody began asking them if her sister was dead. Now, the autopsy performed by Dr. John Butts of the NC Office of Chief Medical Examiners found that Reesa had been stabbed 18 times, and the blade of the steak knife believed to be used had broken off in her right shoulder. One stab wound had actually severed her spinal cord, and she also had a defense wound on the back of her left hand, meaning that she had fought her attacker. Now, due to being found nude, a sexual assault kit was administered, and sperm was found on her leg. A partial fingerprint that did not belong to Reesa was found on her right little finger, and her fingernails were scraped for evidence, and a piece of wood was also found in her cheek. Now, hairs were also found on her neck, though they did not have the roots for identification. They were determined to be African American hair. Though during this time period, there was no technology to create a DNA profile with all of this evidence, so it was really just kept and sealed up, hoping to be able to use it later. Now, Jody, being one of the only people who was around that area at the time and who had last seen Reesa, was questioned, and she told police that after the boys left, she noticed that Reesa was gone, and so she thought she had gone over to her grandparents' house, and she went to head over herself, but she said that she saw that the cars were gone, and so she thought that Reesa had left with her grandparents to go run some errands, so she ended up heading back home. However, she said later when she heard the screaming and she saw her grandfather through the bedroom window, she ended up seeing him clenching his fists until they were turning white, and he was screaming and crying, and that is when she ran over. She entered the room that he was standing in, and that's when she saw the blood everywhere, and there was something covered in a blanket, and when she got closer, she saw skin and hair. Now, witnesses would quickly come forward, and in fact, they all had the same story. 9 individuals who were all believed to be neighbors of that area would report to police that they had seen a black male in the area at the time. 5 of those said that he was running around the same time of the murder, though some of the descriptions of this man did differ, and the direction in which he was traveling also differed as well. But even with the evidence of sexual assault, the African American hair found on her body, and the black male seen running in the area, police began to point the finger at anyone they could. And first, it was Jim and Paul, the friends that had come over that day. And then it was the girl's grandfather, Walt. And then it was Reese's 13-year-old sister, Jody, who claimed to be alone next door at the time. Now, for some reason, the rumor about Jody really stuck. And hearing that she could possibly be a suspect, the police didn't do anything to negate this. The town began to shun this little girl. At the funeral is really where the rumors began to stem from, because Jody was said to show no emotion, and many took this as proof that she was the killer. And then Reese's best friend and her mother began to say that they fully blamed Jody. Now, Jody was interrogated by the police, and this was done without her parents in attendance, even though she was 13, and they repeatedly asked if she had killed her sister, and Jody continued to deny this, and she said that her sister was a wonderful person and she missed her. She gave all sorts of DNA samples to the police at this time, But even their mother began to doubt Jodi's innocence due to the amount of questioning that the police were doing even towards her about her own daughter, and the fact that the town had really turned against her. But police had found no evidence of this black male seen in the area, nor did they have evidence against Jodi or any of the other family members, and they could not connect this murder to anybody. And so Reesa's case was growing cold. Now, the FBI did release a suspect profile around this time, but they claimed the killer was likely a white male between 18 and 24 who knew Reesa, but not personally. The suspect was believed to have emotional problems, and that after the murders, he would have sought outlets for his guilt. Now, 5 months after the murder, with nothing being done, no arrests being made, Reesa's grandfather, Walt, spoke out against the police, saying that they weren't doing enough, that there wasn't enough investigators on the case. Other residents believed that they weren't devoting enough time to this case, they were dragging their feet, because still 5 months later, nobody knew how this 15-year-old girl had been killed inside of her grandparents' home. 4 years later, and nothing much had changed. The Salisbury police had admitted that they had different detectives being assigned throughout the years, but they hadn't made any progress. The rumors about Jodi hadn't stopped for all this time either. It had just moved to social media, and there were actually Facebook groups made about and against Jodi. Then in 2018, 34 years since the murder, Jodi would write to the Dr. Phil show asking if they could help her prove her innocence. They agreed, and they planned to give her a polygraph test on air, which she had never been given by the police. She said she asked even back when she was 13. Jodi spoke about how being thought of her sister's killer by the entire town still haunts her today. She said she had to endure decades of gossip, and at this point she was in her 40s, and she was asked on this polygraph test, did you stab Reesa? And did you stab Reesa with a knife?
And your answer was?
No.
And the results are that you were non-deceptive, you were telling the truth.
The email that you sent to the show asking for Dr. Phil's assistance, you described your sister's death as brutally murdered. And usually a criminal will use minimization in their verbiage. In other words, the real murderer might have said that Reesa was stabbed with a knife and died.
Though we know that polygraph tests are not the most reliable, this would change this case forever for the family. See, due to Jodi's bravery to come out and speak out about this case, she sparked a renewed interest 3 decades later, and that pushed the police to have to do more. In November 2018, the Detective Sergeant Travis Schellenberger decided to review the files and resubmit evidence for DNA testing. They were doing this whole new form of testing on the evidence that they had kept. He said he really wanted to clear the case for the family, and Jodi allegedly did a polygraph test for them as well. Jodi wrote on Facebook that she was grateful that Travis was finally making things happen in this case, though Travis was saying that the work would not have been possible if the police and the Emmys who worked on the case originally hadn't preserved evidence. All of that evidence was preserved, but it also was kept, and it wasn't destroyed, and it wasn't, misplaced through all of these years. It really was a miracle. And so fast forward to December 3rd of 2019, and the Salisbury Police Department announced that they had an update on the cold case. Now, at police headquarters, they would hold a press conference with the family in attendance, and they announced that Jodi was instrumental in closing the case, and she was also exonerated in her sister's murder.
Jodi Trexler was instrumental in bringing this case back to the forefront. We would like to say that Jodi has been completely exonerated in this case, and the suspect has no connection to the Trexler or the Monroe family.
They said that a black man with a criminal record likely murdered Reesa that day.
The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation lab report confirmed semen was found in blood on Reesa's body. Semen was also found in Reesa's body at autopsy in the vaginal smear. The person identified by Parabon had a criminal history that included assault with a deadly weapon and had subsequently served an active sentence for that conviction.
At this time, they didn't name the man, saying that there was no way for him to defend himself in a court of law due to a reason that we will get into. Now, Jody and her parents, Gary and Vicky, spoke about the relief and that they believe that they would never get the answers, and that now they're not going to get the answers they want, but they'll get the answers they need. Reese's mother, Vicky, said that she would lie awake in bed wondering if she would ever know, and that maybe now she could sleep.
We will fight for you, whether it's 10, 20, 30, or even 35 years ago that the crime occurred, like the one here today.
But a little about the process of how they found this man was then revealed. And so when the police finally sent this preserved evidence to be tested, the NC State Crime Lab was able to get semen from the vaginal swab. And this sort of testing obviously wasn't available back in 1984. And so when they began to test all of this, they found that it was a male DNA profile. However, this male couldn't be identified in CODIS. At this point, though, the evidence was submitted to the Parabon Nanolabs for a genetic genealogy report. On April 8th of 2019, they received a name, and the chief genealogist, C.C. Moore, explained that they used a process that was quite new called SNP genotyping, where they were able to look at a larger portion of the genetic code and basically predict distant cousins. They then used the public database GED or GED match, and this process had actually been used 87 times prior to this on DNA found at a crime scene. Basically, Cece said that they reverse engineer the family tree to find these killers.
These are techniques that were originally created and developed for people that were adopted, people of any type of unknown parentage, in order to identify their biological families. And we had a lot of success with that. So we knew that the power of genetic genealogy could also help identify unknown suspects and unknown victims of violent crimes.
Now, this is actually the process that was used to crack the case of the Golden State Killer that was solved a year prior to this, and I have a whole case on that. If you want to listen, I will have that linked down below. But this same process had also been used earlier in the same year of 2019 as well to solve the murder of a mother that had happened 47 years prior. Now, this other murder that had just been solved was said to be the oldest unsolved murder in North Carolina, and it happened around 2.5 hours from where Reesa would later be killed. It was a 33-year-old named Bonnie Neighbors who was a secretary to the mayor. She was a homemaker. She focused on church and family, and she was wife to a man named Kenneth Neighbors who was an accountant. She was known well in the town, she was loved, and she vanished on December 14th, 1972 around 2:30 p.m. when she was headed to pick up her 7-year-old son from school. Now, she had her 4-month-old son Glenn with her at the time, and she never made it to the school. And 3 days later, in the freezing cold, her body would be found around 10 miles away from her home on a dirty mattress. She was bound with gunshot wounds to her abdomen, and her 4-month-old was found alive in her arms.
To know that he was strong enough through cold weather to survive. Possibly Bonnie had something to do with that. Her will went into him.
His crying was the reason that she was ultimately located, and this was a miracle that he was still alive, considering that some of the surrounding farmers had lost some of their pigs because it was so cold. But Bonnie had suffered a blow to the head and was beaten, gagged, and blindfolded, and her hands and feet were bound with cloth baby diapers. It was believed she was killed only hours after she vanished, and her car, which she had been driving to go pick up her son, was found in town with no sign of a struggle. There were keys in the front seat, and a fingerprint was found inside, but this was not matched to anyone. Bonnie was allegedly telling everybody around this time that this was the happiest she had ever been in her life, and they had just moved to this spacious ranch home and that they had actually built along this highway. But some residents began to insist that they knew who did this, and they claimed that someone had actually been taking care of Glenn within those 3 days before he was found, and that's how he was still alive. Yet these residents also claimed that even though they were trying to come forward with this information, they were being shut down by someone in power.
After reviewing the case, reading all of the interviews that were done, one thing that sticks in my mind is the proximity of the location of this murdered mother and this young child to a suspect at the time that this occurred.
Now, whereas Reese's case was unsolved for 3 decades, 3.5 decades, Bonnie's case was unsolved for almost 5 decades, even with the large amount of money at the time of a $20,000 reward. And so just months before Reese's killer was caught, in April of 2019, Bonnie's killer was caught after 47 years when a man was arrested over in Florida, and the newly submitted DNA of his finally got a match to the DNA found of Bonnie's case. Larry Joe Scott was a homeless man who lived in North Carolina around the time of Bonnie's murder when he was 18 years old. Now, Larry had a criminal record by the time of his arrest for this murder, and this was for assault of an officer or a firefighter and trespassing. He had an altercation with an employee of a Salvation Army when they told him he was too intoxicated to stay and couldn't come back for 30 days, and he refused to leave, and so when officers arrived, he began to swing at them. He was then asked by a different property owner to leave the area that he was walking around in at one point, and Larry was said to get out a knife and pointed it at this homeowner. But now he was being charged with kidnapping and the first-degree murder of Bonnie Neighbors, 47 years after it occurred.
You can rest. You can rest, sister. Gonna miss you, but you can rest. And there was times I was in the law thinking, I'm gonna go to my grave and not know. You can't understand why a murder can't be solved in that length of time. But it's just a piece of knowing. The word I want to say is it is finished. I know it's not, but it is certainly a good beginning of being finished.
Now, he was awaiting extradition from Florida to North Carolina, and he was in prison for about 3 years before he died in 2022. This was 4 months before he was set to go to trial, and he had passed from lung cancer. Now, investigators hadn't yet determined the motive that Larry would have had and found no connection between him and Bonnie. They said that his fingerprints matched the fingerprint found in Bonnie's car at the time, and so they considered this case closed. And the DA was saying that the evidence against him was conclusive and overwhelming. Investigators were so grateful that they could finally tell Bonnie's sons and the one who was actually with her at the time that they had caught their mother's killer. And Glenn, the baby who survived, is said to now work as a county EMS. Yet some believe that they didn't get the right man. And we'll get more into that theory in a bit. Because Bonnie's case was believed to be solved, and that same year Reese's case was believed to be solved as well. And in Reese's case, we finally did get the name of the believed killer, because a court warrant would reveal that this suspect was believed to be Curtis Edward Blair. It was finally found that he was a very strong candidate to be the unidentified male of that DNA profile. In order to be certain, though, they needed a DNA sample to compare. However, Curtis Edward Blair had died on August 4th of 2004 of acute ventricular failure and congestive heart failure. His remains were located at the Memorial Park Cemetery in Salisbury, North Carolina, where he was a resident when he passed. Investigators exhumed his body in June of 2019 to collect his DNA, but on August 6th of 2019, the profile from Reese's case was determined to be consistent with the DNA obtained from Curtis Blair's body. And so a few months later, that is when they decided to do the press conference and announce it. But Curtis Blair was born on October 26th of 1943 and lived in San Diego County, California before moving to North Carolina. And Curtis actually worked only 2 blocks away from the crime scene at Frito-Lay. He was 40 at the time of the murder, and he had a criminal history of assault with a deadly weapon after robbing 2 men, one at knife point. He pled guilty to this and was sentenced to 3 years. And then 2 years after the murder of Reesa, he moved to San Diego. Now, a knife that belonged to Curtis Blair was actually seized by investigators and sent to the NC State Crime Lab, but strangely enough, they didn't find any traces of blood on this. But due to this suspect being deceased, the police said that the case was closed, and they considered it solved, just like with Bonnie's case. Though in Bonnie's case, many have speculated that Larry Joe Scott wasn't the actual killer like I hinted at prior. And because he died before trial, we may never know the truth. He was adamant that he didn't have anything to do with it, and a journalist who became an author named Charles Heatherly wrote a novel about Bonnie's murder in its entirety. And the following statements are from his book, from his own investigation. And he claimed that when Bonnie was going to pick up her son from school that day, she turned in the opposite direction of the school, and the milkman had come by and allegedly seen her and waved at her, but she didn't respond and seemed very frazzled. Now, this journalist claimed that the officers believed Bonnie was not really headed to the school that day. She was headed to meet her romantic love interest whom she was having an affair with. Now, they followed this theory, allegedly, for the next 4 decades and even identified a person of interest who knew the family and was a prominent person in the community. He allegedly owned a horse barn near the crime scene. And the way that Bonnie was bound was allegedly with knots that is common for horse trainers. But the same year that investigators named Larry Scott as the prime suspect, the other person of interest was no longer a person of interest suddenly. Now, interestingly enough, in a documentary called NC Wanted, Bonnie's family claimed that the Attorney General's task force came to their home when Bonnie was killed and told them that they knew who did it. However, the Attorney General, who was Rufus Edmonston, was later questioned, and he said that he was no longer the Attorney General, but that they had interviewed a strong political family on their horse farm. Now, this family was allegedly a supporter of the Attorney General at the time, but after that interview, they ceased to be friends or supportive of each other at all.
We were told by the FBI and other investigators that was very close to being solved.
Now, the Attorney General said it was possible this man on the horse farm could know something about it. And then he asked him to take a polygraph test, and this man refused. This man was never named, and the family said that they were told by this task force that they could not continue the investigation after that.
We understood that they were asked by some higher person that was in charge of the SBI to get off the case.
The agents told me they were 99.9% sure. And they didn't know why he wasn't brought to trial.
Though the Attorney General said that's not true, it was just that there was nothing more to go on in the case.
I remember he threw his hands up and said, "Boss, done all I can do. I've just gone back and forth, done all I can do." I said, "Well, Max, it's up to you." I do remember that very distinctly.
But according to that book by the journalist, which is called A Wrong Turn, I'll have it linked down below, a week after Bonnie's murder, a woman was called, and she lived in the same town as Bonnie, and she got this threat over the phone, and she said that the person on the other side said, "Bonnie is just the first, you are next." And then there was allegedly 7 of the same calls made to different women throughout the town over the next year. 6 months after Bonnie's murder, a letter was also sent to the newspaper called Dun Daily Record saying, "I know who did it and will not rest until they were punished." And this was signed by a woman named Wendy Johnson, who said she was a friend of Bonnie's. However, they could find no one by that name. Now, this journalist, Charles Heatherly, speaks in this book about whether Larry Joe Scott was Bonnie's killer or whether he had just taken the car that day as a homeless man and taken the car from where it was actually left, brought it back into town, then left the keys and his fingerprint behind. And Charles believes that Larry Scott was just a scapegoat for the real killer, who is that prominent, powerful individual. But why did both of these cases from around the same area take so long to solve? I mean, almost 5 and almost 4 decades. And then by the time that either of them had any sort of evidence or pointed to a killer, it was too late. That seems a bit strange to me. And how in the world did anybody see the evidence of Reesa's body and believe that her younger sister could have been the one to kill her? Why was this suspect that was allegedly found in Bonnie's case being covered up? Why does nobody know the name? Why does nobody know exactly what he knew? And why were the residents told to be quiet? I would love to hear the stories that the residents have, but unfortunately by this time, most of them have passed. And so even though they wanted to say something for all those years, they now can't. Do you think that the fingerprint match from Larry Scott to Bonnie's car confirms that he's the killer? And was there some sort of negligence or cover-up happening in the area in both of these cases? Because can you imagine being a 13-year-old girl and be forever known by the town you live in as your sister's killer with zero evidence? Both of these cases are so extremely strange, and it's wonderful that after so many years there were killers who were named. It just makes you question, was it simply that there wasn't enough technology to catch these killers? Possibly cover-ups occurring in the systems that are supposed to get justice and not prevent it. I hope it wasn't too confusing to combine Reesa's and Bonnie's case, but when I found that Bonnie's case occurred so close to Reesa's and took so long, and then they were both solved the same year, I knew I had to bring it to you guys too, because both of these women deserve to be talked about, and they deserve to have their case solved so much sooner. I think that it's very hard, and I'm sure it is for the families, because although their cases are technically solved, it's harder to feel like there is justice when nobody went to trial, when they didn't ever get to ask questions to know why. Do you know of any other cases that took decades to solve? Leave any down below that you want me to cover. I think these are incredible that after so many years it still can be an option. I think it gives a lot of people hope that have family members who have unsolved cases. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.